short scripture reading, you may be a little bit confused on what Paul is trying to say in 1 Corinthians, but before I dive into what he's saying here in a couple verses, I want to go through the history of Corinth and then talk about Paul a little bit. Now, around 50 A.D., Corinth was known as a commercial city. With the help of the Isthmian Games that they held there, about every year they had, similar to the Olympics of that time, it would bring in vast majority of people from all over Greece would come to Corinth for these games. And because of that, Corinth was one of the most wealthy and luxurious cities in that part of Greece, in that part of the world. Corinth was also known as the highway between northern and southern Greece. And many imports from Italy and Western nations would end up in the ports of Corinth. And because of that and other attractions, a lot of people lived in Corinth, and it brought a lot of travelers and guests to the city of Corinth. Now, among these travelers and those who lived there, the town was known as men who were lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And this is where Paul comes in, because that's not a good thing. And they're doing a lot more other stuff that Paul didn't agree with, and that he decided he needed to straighten them out. Now, Paul made 3 different trips during his mission to the city of Corinth, and he wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians. The first letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, as well as the third, have been lost to history. The second letter is what we now know today as 1 Corinthians, and his fourth letter we know as 2 Corinthians. These are 2 of the 13 books of the Bible that Paul is credited with writing. Now, the city of Corinth was a hub, so to say. And so you can see why Paul, a part of his mission was extremely important of converting the city of Corinth to Christianity. Because with the number of people that lived there and the influence that Corinth had with those around the city, converting them to Christianity and being able to spread the gospel with those around them and everybody who came in was a big deal. And so in chapter 7, Paul is more answering the questions of the Corinthians rather than the questions of his own. And in verses 7 and 8, which we just read, Paul says, "I wish that all of you were as I am." And in this instance, he's talking about singleness. He also addresses those who are unmarried directly and says it is better to stay single. Now, there are a couple of different reasons why Paul says this, but the main reason is because Paul is saying someone who is in a season of singleness can give their undivided attention and energy to serving the Lord. Now, a key word here is wishes. See, Paul recognizes that not everybody is equipped with the ability to live a life of singleness, as well as not everybody is called by God to live a life of singleness. And so as we read further on in chapter 7, here in verse 28, Paul says, "But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I wish to spare you this." So Paul goes further on to talk later on in chapter 7. In verses 32 through 35, he explains, "I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs. How can he please the Lord? But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world. How he can please his wife? And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord." And then further on in chapter 38, he says, "He who marries does right, but he who does not marry does better." Now, I've heard this before outside of what Paul's speaking of, working at the store. A lot of older farmers come in and their relationship advice is questionable at best. But they follow the same thing for a lot of different other reasons. But Paul is teaching us this because in a perfect world, we would be able to give our full and undivided attention to the Lord. And those who are walking in a season of singleness are called to use that singleness to do this. Now, this advice isn't just directed at people in my situation that are younger and maybe before marriage. This advice is for people of all ages, whether you're in a season of singleness due to divorce or being a widow or before marriage. And he's not telling us to not pursue a relationship just because he isn't, but he's talking about the seasonness as a way of providing hope and comfort to those who may be questioning why they're still walking in a season of singleness. He also reminds us that we are to stay in the marital status that God has called us to. Because as we all know, God doesn't call all of us to the same path. And it's easy for people in my position to feel like they're falling short due to societal standards when it comes to marriage or relationships. And everybody has this mold that they feel that everybody should pertain to. But Paul reminds us that God does not care about societal standards or status. It has no impact on our faith journey and our walk with Christ. And at the same time, we have plans. Well, by this age, I'm going to be married with this many kids and have this house and drive this car, and we have everything planned out. We like to set goals and have plans for ourselves. But God says, hold on just a minute. I've got something different planned for you. And it's irritating to us a lot of times, but we have to remember God's timing doesn't always line up with ours. And sometimes what we plan isn't what he's planned. Now in Song of Songs chapter 2, verse 7, it says, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Pretty much don't rush it. Just because everybody else around you is at a certain point in their life, we feel that maybe we should be there too, or we're falling short because we're not there yet. But God has a plan in his own time. It also can be tough because of those around us may not always approve of our plans for our life. Now, I'm going to tell this story, and I didn't let my mom know that I was going to tell this story beforehand, so hopefully she's all right with it. But it was just after my junior year of high school, and she was on me about figuring out where I was going to go to college, what I was going to do, what my plan was for life. And I don't know. When I first got into high school, my plan was I was going to be a welder. Well, I took a couple welding classes, and I got pretty good at sticking metal together, but it didn't look very good. So I figured out pretty quick that wasn't for me. For a little bit, I thought maybe I'd be a teacher, but I didn't really like going to school every day and the schedule and all that. I decided I wouldn't like that either. And so I just finished with the summer baseball season with the rec center, umpiring. And I thought, I really enjoy this officiating and umpiring thing. And growing up, I always had plans. I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. Well, I quickly figured out God did not gift me with the talent to be a Major League Baseball player. But I still wanted to do something where I could work with baseball. And so I just Googled it. What does it take to become a Major League umpire? And it said, go to umpire school, get hired in the minor leagues, work your way up to the big leagues. Oh, that sounds easy enough. I can do that. And so I went home. I go, Mom, I figured out what I was going to do. She said, okay, what's that? I said, I'm going to umpire school. And my parents have always been fully supportive of my decisions and what I'm doing, but doesn't mean they always agree with my decisions or what I'm doing. And at the time, which she admitted a couple years later, that going through her head was, what in the world are you doing? Because, umpire school, she never heard of umpire school, and going halfway across the country for a course that didn't even know what would come of it was a little scary. But it's important to remember that although those around us may not always agree with the plans we have made for ourselves, eventually they come around to it. And the same thing goes for our plans in life when it comes to a season of singleness and that what comes after. Now, I keep referring to it as a season because, well, like we have recently, when is fall going to show up? Which then we had a couple days of this week that felt like winter, and then we're back in the 80s, and we don't know what's going on. And the same thing comes from God in our season of relationships. And so to remind those who are in a season of singleness, or maybe in seasons of relationships, to remember you're there for a reason. God has a plan for you in the season of your life now, including your season of singleness. It's easy to look forward and think, well, when is this going to be over? I'm tired of, being by myself or being alone, whatever. But God has a plan, and has a plan for your season. So to wrap up with what Paul was talking about, remember that the season you are in is a gift from God, and that singleness is a good thing. And you're in that season for a reason. Use it to glorify God, and to remember not to get frustrated with the plans that God has and what season you're in.